Hello, one and all. I hope you're all well. Today's lesson, what we're going to be looking at is our third part of our lessons on the Three Gorges Dam. So just to put it into perspective, what we've looked at so far is we've looked at the introduction to the Three Gorges Dam. We located it. We found out what river it was on. We talked a bit about what the dam is used for and a bit about its construction. Then we started to look at the advantages of the Three Gorges Dam. Now, we're geographers, and if you're a good geographer, you will always look at balancing two sides of an argument before you start to draw some conclusions. So that means that today's lesson is not about the advantages, it's about the other side of the coin, and that other side of the coin are the disadvantages. So I'm just going to present my screen now, just so that I can move over to my slide deck and I can guide you through what we're going to be looking at during today's lesson. So, as I've just mentioned, this lesson we're going to be looking at the disadvantages of the Three Gorges Dam project. Now, we've got a target question, which is very similar to the question that you had in your previous lesson, although there is one slight difference about it. And if we read it through, it says, what are the social, economic and environmental disadvantages of the Three Gorges Dam project? Well, the thing that's different about this question here is the disadvantages. Now, I've very deliberately given you a similar question. And the reason why I've given you a similar question is because you need to keep practicing those skills that you're going to need by the time you get to the end of your GCSE. And I'll talk a bit about those skills when I look at the success criteria that's on the left-hand side here. We need to be able to, as it says here, use connectives and specific pieces of information to explain those negatives. And those are skills that you guys are going to need when it comes to GCSE. So it's all about making sure that we practice. Now, I wouldn't expect you to just be able to answer that question off the bat. So today's lesson is going to guide you through a series of tasks which you're going to build into your final answer to that question. In addition to that, I'm going to show you my model answer to that question, because as I've said before, you don't know, unless you know what success looks like, you don't know what it is that you're aiming for and what it is that you're trying to achieve. Okay, so as with when we looked at the advantages of the Three Gorges Dam project, what we're going to do is we're going to look at some disadvantages, but we're going to place those disadvantages into our three categories that we've used before. And remember, our three categories, and these come up time and time again when it comes to geography, are social, economic and environmental. And if we look at these three pictures that are up here on the screen right now, you can see that social are the impacts that affect people. Economic is very much about the impacts that affect money. And then environmental, well, that's all about nature. Now, sometimes we get impacts and effects that aren't just social. They could be social and economic, or they could even be social, economic and environmental. Okay, so it's difficult to characterize some of these, and I'm not actually too fussed about how you characterize impacts. What I'm more bothered about is how you justify placing them into those different categories. And there'll be a bit more about that later. So just to recap the story so far, we've looked at the advantages, and you've created a grid which looks very similar to the grid that's up on the screen right now, where you have the social advantages. So we had things like the reduced risk of flooding. We talked about how we could use the water from the reservoir to be able to irrigate or water crops. We talked about the economic advantages, how building the dam makes the river more navigable for boats, which means that it's easier for trade to make more money across China. We talked about the jobs that are created as a consequence of the dam. And we also started talking about how the dam was become a tourist attraction, perhaps maybe for geeks like me that like going to a big infrastructure project when they're on holiday. We've also talked about some of the environmental advantages, and the environmental advantages of this are very much on a global scale, because hydroelectric power is generated, which is a renewable energy source that doesn't use any fossil fuels, which in turn doesn't contribute to global warming and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So on the face of it, at the moment, this looks like a positive scheme. If I gave you this information and said to you, should China build the Three Gorges Dam, I would imagine that the answer would be a resounding yes. But as I said earlier, it's really important that we can balance out our arguments, not just looking at the positive sides, but looking at the negatives before we start to draw a conclusion. So before I introduce you to some of my negatives, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a short video clip. It's about 6 minutes long. It comes from Channel 4 News. And what it does is it guides us through some of those negative aspects of the Three Gorges Dam project. Now, I don't want you to write anything down whilst you're watching this video, but what I want you to ask yourself in your head whilst you're watching it is, what are those negatives that are coming out here? Particularly, I want you to focus on the negatives for the people that live in the area around the dam itself. Let's have a little look.
Well, now the project could lead to catastrophe. Not the words of a dissident environmentalist, but the official Chinese news agency in a story about the Three Gorges Dam. For the first time since the project was started in the 1980s, government scientists have started to express concern about landslides and water pollution caused by the biggest dam in the world. The government also wants to tout the Three Gorges Dam as China's greatest source of renewable energy. From Chongqing, on the banks of the Yangtze River, our Beijing correspondent Lindsay Hilson has this report.
400 kilograms of dynamite, and the town of Kaixin is no more. Demolished to make way for flooding by China's most controversial project, the Three Gorges Dam. It's the last to go. The rising waters have already forced more than 1 million people to relocate. The event is shown on TV as a triumph for Chinese engineers and urban planners.
Okay, so what we've got going on in this part of the video is we've got these buildings and towns and villages, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, being destroyed. And the reason why they're being destroyed and blown to smithereens using dynamite is so that they can make way for this huge reservoir that's going to go behind this dam. Okay, remember, reservoirs, you know, they need to flood lots and lots of land. And invariably, lots of people live along rivers. So lots of people lived along the Yangtze River, and over 1 million people were talking about being displaced and having to move away from their homes, which is quite staggering.
The Three Gorges is the world's biggest dam, consuming more stone, concrete and steel than any other. It's also the world's biggest hydroelectric power plant, something the Chinese government wants to advertise. On an official tour, we're given the official line.
It's a big advantage to use hydropower rather than coal. This dam is replacing a coal-fired power station which would consume 50 million tonnes of coal per year.
Okay, so this is the Chinese government's official take on this, and they're talking through some of those advantages that we looked at in our last lesson, saying that, you know, this is a renewable energy source which is good for the environment, so it's right that we build it.
Annual emissions are reduced by 150 million tonnes. This is a great environmental achievement.
The giant turbine room, part of China's plan to triple its hydroelectric capacity by 2020. Local journalists cluster around to hear the spiel. Environmental protection has always been the priority. That's the line they're told to repeat. Let's go, says the guide. Not much time to challenge today's message.
Looking at the progress and the initial efficiency of the project, all the problems are basically tackled.
But it's not that simple, and they know it. The government laid on a boat to take us up the giant reservoir created by the dam. 175 meters marks the height the waters will reach when the project's completed in 2009. The reservoir bank is scarred by landslides, which geologists say are caused by erosion as the water level rises and falls.
Okay, so again, we've got some more impacts here on people. You've got landslides as the water level rises and falls. It's destabilizing the banks of the reservoir and it's causing these landslides. In on themselves, they might not be a big problem, but if you look at what we've got here on top of those landslides, we've got people's homes, and there's going to be knock-on impacts of that.
We left the official tour and took a boat to the village of Miaohe, about 10 miles from the dam. The people here have already been moved uphill to avoid the rising water, but this summer the earth beneath them subsided. Great cracks appeared in the houses.
For 2 or 3 years, it feels as if our house has been stretching itself. It's been cracking little by little. We heard somebody saying, it's a landslide and the earth is splitting. The neighbors began to run. That's when we knew it was really bad.
Government officials told the villagers that the landslip was not caused by the dam, and the money they were given afterwards wasn't compensation. And she says they've been warned.
They don't let us talk to journalists. They'll punish us for saying bad things about them. You shouldn't say you're journalists. Say you're tourists. They will chase you. They will say, go away. Don't come here.
Okay, that seems very, very strange to us, but in China, things are very, very different. You've got a government which is very much in control, and they don't like it when people talk against the official line of the government. So these journalists have got to be really careful where they're reporting some of the negative things about the Three Gorges Dam, because that's not going to sit very nicely with the local government within this area of China.
Further along the hillside, new houses are being built for the villagers, partially subsidized by government loans. The party chief isn't very happy to see us. He too has been told not to talk to journalists. These houses are being built on rock. They should be much more stable. But the government's line on the landslips seems to vary. Sometimes they say landslips are just a natural phenomenon. At others, that they are a consequence of building the Three Gorges Dam, but everything was predicted and everything's being dealt with. Professor Lei Hongshun should know. He's been studying the impact of the Three Gorges Dam for more than 20 years.
Comparing what was foreseen before the dam construction to the issues we face today, I have to say we're confronting many more problems than we predicted. Despite all the efforts, no one can guarantee that landslides are completely controlled. Nobody can predict when and where landslides take place, nor promise there'll be no more in the reservoir area.
Chongqing, the world's fastest growing municipality, with population already 31 million. The infrastructure can't keep up. The city lies at the western end of the reservoir, and effluent flows directly into the water. Before the dam, the Yangtze flowed faster and flushed it away. Now it stagnates.
The government must change its overall concept. Now, the strategy is to treat the head when there's a headache and the foot when it hurts. We don't have a comprehensive plan to fix the environmental problems related to the dam.
Like the pyramids or the Parthenon, government propaganda portrays the dam as a miracle of human endeavor, a symbol of the greatness of modern Chinese civilization. But China's now judged as much by its environmental record as its engineering prowess. And propaganda can't solve the real problems caused by the Three Gorges Dam. Lindsay Hilson, Channel 4 News, Chongqing.
Okay, right, now that gives us quite a lot of information about the dam, particularly about the disadvantages of the Three Gorges Dam. What I'd like us to do now is to kind of simplify some of the things that we saw within that video and break it down into manageable chunks that we can use in order to build into our question, which we're going to tackle towards the end of this lesson. So here's some of the economic costs, okay? This dam was huge. It's the largest dam in the world, and you can see it from space. So on that scale, it's going to be really, really expensive. And the estimated total cost of building the dam is $23 billion, okay? Now, we're talking about a time in China where there's still lots of poverty. There is an argument to be had that this $23 billion that's been spent building the dam could have been better spent on other things. In addition to that, what we've got are the landslides. So landslides have become really common, and you saw them in the video, particularly in villages that are close to the dam. And some people have even lost their homes as a consequence of that. Where people's homes originally were destroyed because of the reservoir and where they'd been rebuilt on the banks of the reservoir, sometimes even lost their new homes that had been provided for them by the government. Then we've got people being forced out of their homes for that huge reservoir. So I've got here that 150 towns, 4,000 villages had to be destroyed to build this huge dam. And that's, let's face it, a lot of people losing their homes, losing their communities, losing their villages, losing their towns that they've grown up in. And you can see in this image here some of the demolition work that had to go ahead to be able to flood all of these towns and villages. Then what we've got are the impacts on wildlife. Now, a dam is a natural barrier, not natural barrier, it's very much a human barrier, but it's a barrier. And that barrier prevents things from flowing downstream. Now, unfortunately, there's lots of pollution in China, particularly on the banks of rivers such as the River Yangtze. But by having a dam there, what you're doing is you're preventing all of the toxic waste from flowing downstream. So it just builds up in the river rather than flowing out to sea, and has a huge impact on natural freshwater environments, such as the destruction of fish species. Now, what I've done is I've taken some symbols to go with each of those different slides, and you probably will have noticed them in the bottom right-hand side. So here we've got a symbol with a fish with a cross through it, which is referring to the impact on wildlife and the fact that the toxic waste can't flow downstream, which kills fish species. You've got this one, which is the house with the cross through it, and the 150 on the top and the 4,000 on the bottom, referring to the 150 towns and the 4,000 villages that needed to be destroyed to make way for the reservoir. Then we've got these symbols here where you can see these mountain sides with the slides going down them. That represents the landslides and the landslips of people losing their homes. And finally, this is meant to be a money note, and it says here 23 billion, which is showing us the economic cost. So what I want you guys to do now is I actually want you to work from memory if you can, rather than going from everything that I've been talking through, because studies show that if you're using your work in memory, actually, it's far better in terms of your learning and embedding that into your knowledge and understanding. So if I have a look at my mind map, which I've created with these symbols, it says the disadvantages of the Three Gorges Dam. So my first disadvantage is that it cost a lot of money, 23 billion. It caused landslides, which meant that people lost their homes. It caused the destruction of 150 towns and 4,000 villages. And because the sewage couldn't flow, it destroys lots and lots of wildlife. Now, I've put a 3-minute timer up here on the screen. So what I'd like you guys to do now is to use those symbols, which are up there on the slideshow. And I want you to use those symbols to write down in a Google document, which you can submit via Google Classrooms for this work, just some simple bullet points of some disadvantages. Okay, so you've got 4 disadvantages that are on those symbols up on the screen. Okay, and I want you to see if you can do that from your working memory. And your 3 minutes starts from now. Off you go, guys. Okay, right, fantastic stuff, guys. Hopefully what you've now got then is you've got some bullet points down for some of the disadvantages, and you can use some of those disadvantages when you're writing your final piece towards the end of this lesson. The next thing that I want us to do is I want us to start categorizing. Now, I've put some symbols up here. So I've got a little pound sign, okay, for economic. I've got a person doing yoga, which represents social, because remember, social impacts are all about people. And I've got this nice little tree here for the environmental impact. I've got a 2-minute countdown timer down here in the bottom right-hand side. What I would like you to do now is I'd like you to go down your list where you've put your bullet points of each of those different negative impacts of the Three Gorges Dam. And I'd like you next to them to put in brackets some kind of categorization. So I'd like you to categorize them to say whether or not they're economic, social, or environmental impacts. Okay, I'm going to give you 2 minutes to do this, but if you need more time, that's absolutely fine. Okay, you can always press pause, and just remember what I said at the beginning. Okay, quite often there are things that may spill over into more than one category, so it's okay to categorize something as both economic and social. 2-minute time is about to start. Away you go. Okay, right, fantastic stuff then, guys. Now, you may have categorized it in a slightly different way to me. That, again, is absolutely fine. I'm just going to show you how I categorized it. So we've got the cost here of the negative being 23 billion US dollars. I've categorized that as economic because it is primarily about money. The landslides here I've put as both environmental and social. And I've put them as both environmental and social because they're social because it's destroying people's homes, but actually landslides in themselves is an environmental thing to happen. It can cause environmental damage. In terms of the houses and villages that have been destroyed, I've put that again as both economic and social. It costs a lot of money to rebuild people's homes, but at the same time, they're people's homes and people's livelihoods. So I feel like that should fit across both of those categories. And finally, the issue with sewage and the issue with fish and fish species, I've categorized as being environmental. So what I want us to do now then is I want us to take some of that information and I would like us to look at the target question. Now, the target question says, what are the social, economic and environmental disadvantages of the Three Gorges Dam project? And this is what I want you to answer on your Google document. And it's what I want you to submit via Google Classrooms. Now, in order for us to be able to do that, we're going to need to be able to use our categories that we've already come up with. And we're going to need to use connectives and specific pieces of information because remember, geography is the study of the real world. So we need to be able to give real world examples to be able to explain those negatives. Now, I've got some sentence starters here for you to help you out. But before I give you those sentence starters, let's just have a look at my model answer so that you know what sort of thing you're aiming for. So I've put, there are many disadvantages to the Three Gorges Dam project. Some of these are economic. For example, the project cost a staggering $23 billion. This is money that could have been spent helping people out of poverty. In addition to this, there were some social negatives. 150 towns and 4,000 villages had to be destroyed to make way for the reservoir. This means that many people will have lost their homes. The construction of the dam has made the banks on each side of the reservoir unstable. This has caused landslides. There are also environmental negatives, such as sewage being unable to move down the river. As a consequence of this, many fish species will suffer. Now, what you'll notice in my model answer is that I've put certain things in different colours. So firstly, in red, I've been really clear on where I've highlighted economic, social and environmental. So, you know, I'm showing someone that's reading it that I understand the differences between social effects, economic effects and environmental effects. I've also put in green some specific pieces of information that link to this example. So rather than just saying it costs a lot of money, I've given a specific. I've said that it cost £23 billion to build it. Rather than saying towns and villages were destroyed, I've said that 150 towns were destroyed and 4,000 villages were destroyed. So, you know, I'm really showing that I've got a good in-depth knowledge and understanding. Now, in addition to that, what I've done is I've highlighted in orange or yellow where I've used connectives. And remember, connectives are really important to be able to develop your answers and your responses. I've put, in addition to this, there were. This means that many people. As a consequence of this, many fish species will suffer. So it's about really being able to develop your answers and developing your answers by using those connectives. Now, if I go back a slide, you can see here that you've got some sentence starters that are designed to support you and provide you with that scaffold. There are disadvantages to the Three Gorges Dam project. The social disadvantages include, the economic disadvantages include, the environmental disadvantages such as, and remember, you've got to use connectives and give specific pieces of information. So your final task then is going to be able to answer that target question. What I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to pause this video, okay, and take the time that you need to be able to respond to the question, okay? Once you've responded to the question, okay, you are all done for this part of the lesson. Next lesson, what we're going to be doing is taking both the advantages and disadvantages, and we're going to be using our own minds to be able to come up with a conclusion. Okay, push pause, complete the question, and let me know if you've got any problems or issues.